the silk of the wedding dress. A thing that had cost more than her father's last 2 horses was now a tattered flag of surrender. It snagged on every thorny bush and sharp-edged rock, tearing with a sound like a soft scream. Clara didn't care. She welcomed the destruction of the fine lace and imported thread. It was a cage, and she was tearing her way out of it one ragged breath at a time. Her feet, stripped of their delicate satin shoes hours ago, were a mess of raw flesh and crusted blood. Each step on the baked Wyoming plateau was a fresh agony, a reminder of the life she had just fled. She had been running since dawn. The sun, a merciless white eye in a bleached blue sky, had climbed to its peak and was now beginning its slow descent, painting the western horizon in cruel shades of orange and pink. The land offered no comfort. It was a hard, wind-blasted place of shallow ravines, cracked earth, and clusters of prickly pear cactus that seemed to reach for her ankles with a special kind of malice. She limped through them, her breath catching in her throat, a series of dry, hacking sobs that held no tears. She had no more tears to give. They had been spent in a locked room, on a fine bed, under the heavy hand of a man she had called husband for less than a day. Royce Langley. The name was a foul taste in her mouth. He was a cattle baron, a man whose wealth was measured in acres and livestock, whose influence stretched across 3 territories. He was also the man to whom her father, a gentleman drowning in whiskey and debt, had traded her. The deal was simple, clean as a butcher's knife, a daughter for a clean ledger. She was the final, most valuable commodity her family possessed. She had stood beside Royce at the altar, a silent, trembling lamb, and felt the weight of his ownership settle on her like a shroud. The wedding vows had been a death sentence, the beating that followed, a confirmation of its terms. He had wanted to break her spirit on their first day as man and wife, to stamp his brand on her as he would a heifer. But he had underestimated the flicker of defiance that still burned within her. While he slept, drunk on whiskey and victory, she had slipped out a window, leaving behind the dress's matching shoes, but taking with her the pain and the fury that now fueled her flight. Her legs burned, and a sharp, insistent pain radiated from her ribs where Royce's fist had found its mark. Her vision swam in and out of focus. The vast, empty landscape seemed to tilt and sway. The horizon shimmered, promising water where there was only heat and dust. She knew she was dying. The thought held no terror, only a weary resignation. It was better than the alternative. Better than being dragged back to that grand house, to that cold bed, to a life of methodical cruelty. She stumbled, her bare foot catching on a loose rock, and pitched forward into a shallow ravine. The fall knocked the last of the air from her lungs. She lay there, face down in the dirt, the taste of blood and dust on her tongue, and listened to the hammering of her own heart. It was a frantic, desperate rhythm, the sound of an animal caught in a trap. For a long time, she did not move. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky bled from orange to a deep, bruised purple. A chill began to seep into the air. Far to the north, a low rumble echoed across the plains. A storm was coming. She should have been afraid, but she felt nothing. She was a hollowed-out thing, a shell of the girl she had been that morning. The rumble grew louder, closer, a deep-throated growl that vibrated through the ground. The wind picked up, whipping her torn dress against her skin and filling the air with a fine grit that stung her eyes. Then the rain came, not a gentle spring shower, but a violent, driving deluge. Cold, heavy drops hammered down, turning the dry dust to a thick, greasy mud in seconds. A flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the stark, unforgiving landscape in a brilliant, ghostly white. It was followed by a crack of thunder so loud it felt as if the world were being torn in two. The ravine where she lay began to fill with a torrent of brown, churning water. It swirled around her, cold and insistent, soaking her to the bone. She tried to push herself up, to crawl to higher ground, but her limbs refused to obey. The last of her strength was gone. The water rose, pulling at her, and she closed her eyes. She thought of her mother, buried a year ago, and wondered if she would see her soon. The world went dark, not from the night, but from a deeper, more final blackness that rose up from within. She collapsed into the mud, a broken doll in a ruined white dress, and knew no more. Eli Monroe watched the storm from the meager shelter of a rock outcropping. His horse, a steady buckskin named Dust, stood close by, unbothered by the celestial violence. Eli felt a kinship with the storm. There was a rage in it that mirrored the one that lived in his own chest, a cold, empty fury that had been his only companion for 2 long years. He was camped alone in the basin, a place few men traveled, and that was just how he liked it. The company of men brought trouble. He had learned that lesson the hard way. When the worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind a steady, chilling drizzle, he moved back toward his small camp. He had a simple canvas tent, a bedroll, and a fire pit. Now a circle of hissing, blackened stones. He was checking on Dust, running a hand down the horse's damp flank. When the animal's ears pricked up, Dust lifted his head and stared out into the gloom, toward the small watering hole 100 yards away. Eli went still, his hand hovering over the butt of the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. He listened. There was nothing but the patter of the rain and the sigh of the wind. Still, the horse remained alert. "Easy, boy," Eli murmured, his voice a low rasp. He trusted the horse's instincts more than his own. He moved slowly, deliberately, his boots making soft sucking sounds in the mud. As he drew closer to the watering hole, a patch of white against the dark earth caught his eye. It was unnatural, out of place. He approached with caution, his heart a slow, heavy drum in his chest. He half expected to find a dead calf, or perhaps a lost sheep. He found a woman. She was lying face down in the mud, half submerged in the runoff from the storm. Her white dress was in tatters, smeared with dirt and blood. Her hair, a dark spill of chestnut, was fanned out in the shallow water. For a moment, he thought she was dead. He reached down, his fingers hesitating before they touched the pale, cold skin of her neck. He was a fool. This was trouble. He knew it with a certainty that settled deep in his bones. The last time he had stopped to help a stranger, it had ended in blood and fire, and the town of Granite Gulch branding him a coward. He should turn around. He should get on his horse and ride away and never look back. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But then his fingers found it, a faint, thready pulse, a flicker of life in the cold mud. He let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. A curse escaped his lips, low and bitter. He could not leave her, the part of him that was still a man, the part that had not been scoured away by grief and regret, would not allow it. He knelt in the mud, and with a grunt of effort, he carefully turned her over. Her face was pale as milk, bruised along one cheekbone. Her lips were blue with cold. Her eyes were closed, her dark lashes stark against her colorless skin. She was young, younger than he was, maybe 20, and she was hurt. He could see the dark, ugly bruises that marred the skin of her wrists, angry purple marks that looked like fingerprints. As he gathered her into his arms, his hand brushed against her side, and he felt the unmistakable ridge of swollen flesh beneath the wet silk. Someone had hurt her, and hurt her badly. He carried her back to his camp. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight in his arms. He laid her down gently inside the small canvas tent, on top of his own bedroll. He worked with a grim, silent efficiency. He built up the fire, coaxing a flame from the damp wood until it blazed, casting flickering shadows against the tent walls. He stripped off her ruined dress, his movements deft and impersonal, his eyes carefully averted. He wrapped her in his driest blanket, tucking it tightly around her shivering form. He saw more then, a constellation of bruises across her ribs. the angry red lines of cuts and scrapes on her legs. He cleaned the wounds as best he could with water from his canteen and a strip of cloth torn from a spare shirt. He did not ask questions, not even of himself. The answers were none of his business. All that mattered was the here and now, the simple task of keeping this stranger alive through the night. He sat by the fire, watching the entrance to the tent, his rifle across his lap. The rain had stopped, and the stars were beginning to appear, cold and distant in the scrubbed, clean sky. He was a fool. He was letting trouble walk right back into his life. But as he sat there, listening to the soft, shallow breaths coming from inside the tent, he knew he could not have done anything else. Clara woke to the smell of wood smoke and wet wool. For a moment, she was adrift, untethered from memory. Then it all came rushing back. The wedding, Royce, the flight, the storm. She sat up with a gasp, her body screaming in protest. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and the world tilted violently. She was in a small tent, wrapped in a coarse, heavy blanket. A fire crackled just outside the entrance, casting a warm, orange glow on the canvas walls. And there was a man. He was sitting by the fire, his back to her, a silhouette against the flames. He was broad-shouldered, with a stillness about him that was both calming and unnerving. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her exhaustion. Had Royce's men found her? Was this another cage? She scrambled backward, trying to push herself away, a small, choked cry escaping her lips. The man turned at the sound. He moved not with a start, but with a slow, deliberate motion. In the firelight, she saw his face. It was a hard face, weathered by sun and wind, with a dark stubble covering a square jaw. His eyes were shadowed, unreadable. He was not one of Royce's men. She had never seen him before. "Easy now," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It didn't matter. He was a man, a stranger, and she was alone with him in the wilderness. The same terror that had propelled her out of Royce's house seized her again. She tried to get to her feet, to run, but a blinding pain shot through her ribs, and her legs buckled beneath her. She collapsed back onto the bedroll, gasping for breath, the darkness threatening to swallow her again. The man was inside the tent now, kneeling beside her. She flinched as he reached for her, trying to shrink away, but she had nowhere to go. His touch, when it came, was not what she expected. His hand was calloused and rough, but his grip on her arm was surprisingly gentle as he helped her lie back down. "You're hurt," he said. It was not a question. "You need to rest." He offered her a canteen. She stared at it, then at him, her eyes wide with suspicion. He seemed to understand. He opened it, took a small drink himself, and then held it out to her again. Her throat was parched, a desert of its own. She hesitated for another moment, then took the canteen with a trembling hand and drank. The water was cool and clean, the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. He tended to her wounds again, his movements patient and methodical. He said nothing, asked nothing. He simply worked, his focus entirely on the task at hand. His silence was a strange sort of comfort. It was a blank space, a void where there were no accusations, no demands, no expectations. He did not ask her name, or where she came from, or how she had come to be passed out in a mud puddle in the middle of nowhere. For that, she was grateful. As she lay there, drifting on the edge of sleep, images flickered behind her closed eyelids. Her father's face, not sad, but resigned, as he told her of the arrangement. "It is for the good of the family, Clara," he had said, his eyes refusing to meet hers. She saw Royce's smile, a thin, predatory curve of his lips as he lifted her veil, the click of the bedroom door locking, the sharp, blooming pain that had stolen her breath. She had been wed and beaten on the same day, her body and her future signed over in one brutal transaction. She was no longer Clara May Thompson. She was Mrs. Royce Langley, a piece of property. Later, she did not know how much later, she woke again. The man had moved the fire closer to the tent's entrance. He handed her a tin plate with a piece of cooked rabbit on it. She ate slowly, forcing the food down, knowing she needed the strength. They sat in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the lonely cry of a distant coyote. The warmth of the flames pushed back the night's chill, but it could not touch the cold that had settled deep inside her. "I can't go back there," she whispered. The words came out before she could stop them, a fragile puff of air. "I won't survive it." The man looked at her. His expression did not change, but she saw something flicker in the depths of his dark eyes, a shadow of understanding. Perhaps. He did not offer empty words of comfort or promise that everything would be all right. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was enough. The long night wore on. Clara eventually drifted into a restless, troubled sleep. The blanket clutched in her fist. Her dreams were a chaotic landscape of fear and pain. She cried out, small, whimpering sounds that were swallowed by the vast emptiness of the plains. Each time, she would wake with a start, her heart pounding, and find the man still there, sitting by the fire, keeping watch. He was a silent, brooding guardian, a stranger who had pulled her from the mud and brought her into the small circle of his firelight. He was haunted by his own past, by ghosts she could not see, but for one night, he kept hers at bay, and as the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, she finally fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, unaware of the quiet vigil he kept over her. The morning light was a pale, watery thing, filtering through the canvas of the tent. It offered no warmth. Clara felt the chill deep in her bones, a damp cold that had little to do with the morning air. Every muscle in her body ached with a profound weariness, but a stubborn resolve pushed her to move. She could not be a burden. This man, this silent stranger, had saved her from the storm, but she could not expect him to save her from her life. She had to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between herself and Royce Langley. She pushed the blanket aside and slowly, carefully, swung her legs over the side of the bedroll. Her feet were a disaster of dried blood and angry cuts. The pain was a sharp, steady throb. She ignored it, gritting her teeth. She used the tent pole for support and pulled herself upright. For a dizzying second, the world swayed, and black spots danced in her vision. A sharp, searing pain tore through her side, and she cried out, a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Her legs gave way, and she would have fallen if Eli had not been there. He moved with a surprising quickness, his arm catching her around the waist, holding her steady. His touch was firm, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt of heat through her cold skin. He eased her back down onto the bedroll. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of sympathy. "I have to go," she said, her own voice a ragged whisper. "I can't stay here." He looked down at her, his dark eyes taking in her bruised face, her trembling limbs, the sheer exhaustion etched into every line of her body. "You can't even stand," he stated, a simple, brutal fact. "I have to," she insisted, trying to push herself up again. A futile gesture of defiance. He didn't stop her with his hands this time. He stopped her with his words. "You'll die out here like that." He spoke without emotion, as if commenting on the weather. "You might make it a mile, maybe 2, then you'll fall, and the coyotes or the buzzards will find you before anyone else does. That's what's waiting for you." His bluntness was a slap, but it was also the truth. She stared at the canvas wall, the fight draining out of her. He was right. She was trapped, not by a man this time, but by the weakness of her own body. A single tear, hot and bitter, escaped and traced a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, he turned and left the tent. She heard him moving around the camp, the soft clink of metal, the murmur of his voice as he spoke to his horse. He returned a few minutes later with a piece of dried meat and the canteen. He set them down beside her. "Eat," he commanded, and left again. She did as she was told. She ate the tough, salty meat and drank the cool water, and with each bite, each swallow, she felt a tiny spark of strength return. An hour later, he had packed the camp. The tent was gone, the fire was out, and the horse was saddled. He came to the place where she sat, wrapped in the blanket. "I'm heading up into the hills," he said. "It's rough country. No one will find you there. You can ride with me, or you can stay here and die. It makes no difference to me." She looked up at his impassive face. He was offering her a choice, but it was no choice at all. She gave a small, jerky nod. Without another word, he bent down, scooped her into his arms as easily as if she were a child, and set her on the horse's back. He mounted behind her, his body a solid, warm wall against her own. She flinched at the contact, a reflexive tensing of her muscles, but he seemed not to notice. He took the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, urged the horse forward. They made a slow journey deeper into the wilderness. The flat, open plains gave way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and sagebrush. The air grew cooler, cleaner. They rode in silence. The only sounds the steady plod of the horse's hooves and the sigh of the wind through the sparse vegetation. Clara was acutely aware of the man behind her, his chest pressed against her back. His arm brushed hers as he held the reins. It was an intimacy that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. He made no move, said no word. That was anything but necessary. He was a constant, steady presence, a shield against the vast, indifferent landscape. They began to speak, but their words were like small, cautious animals emerging from hiding. She asked nothing of him, nothing about his name, his past, or his destination. To ask would be to create a debt, and she had nothing left to pay with. He, in turn, offered only what she needed. "Hold on," he would say before they navigated a steep incline. "Drink," he would command when he felt her begin to sway with fatigue. It was a language of necessity, stripped of all pleasantries, and yet, in its own way, it was a form of communication more honest than any she had ever known. They camped that night by a cold, fast-running creek that tumbled down from the higher peaks. The water was clear as glass, rushing over a bed of smooth, gray stones. After they had eaten another silent meal of roasted rabbit, Eli turned his back to her and began checking the horse's hooves. It was a clear, unspoken signal, an offering of privacy. Clara looked down at herself. The blanket she wore was his underneath it. She was naked. The wedding dress, the source of her ruin, lay in a muddy, torn heap where he had left it to dry. It was stiff with grime and stained with her own blood. A wave of revulsion washed over her. She could not bear to look at it, let alone put it on again. With a resolve that surprised her, she stood up, letting the blanket fall to the ground. She walked to the edge of the creek, her bare feet sinking into the soft, damp earth. The frigid water swirled around her ankles, so cold it felt like fire, but she welcomed the sensation. It was real. It was clean. She picked up the ruined dress and waded deeper into the creek, the water rising to her knees, then her waist. She began to wash the dress, scrubbing at the mud and blood with numb fingers, the silk heavy and slick in her hands. She was not trying to salvage it. She was performing an exorcism, trying to wash away the memory of Royce's hands, the scent of his whiskey, the feel of the fine room that had been her prison. Eli had told himself he would not look. He had turned his back to give her a moment to herself, a small courtesy in a world that had shown her none. But the sound of her moving, the soft splash of water, drew his gaze against his will. He glanced over his shoulder, and the sight of her stopped the breath in his chest. She stood in the middle of the creek, the moonlight turning her pale skin to silver. Her back was to him, her dark hair clinging to her wet shoulders. She was thin, almost frail, but there was a strength in the set of her shoulders, a determination in the way she worked at the ruined dress. He felt a sharp, unfamiliar pang in his gut, a tangled knot of guilt and longing. It was wrong to watch her. It was a violation, but he could not look away. And then he saw them. Faint, silvery lines that crisscrossed the pale skin of her back. They were old scars, thin and white, but there were newer marks as well. Angry red welts that stood out in stark relief. Whip scars. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. A cold, black rage. An emotion he had thought long dead, coiled in his stomach. Someone had taken a whip to this woman. They had marked her like an animal. As if she could feel his eyes on her, she suddenly went still. Her hands stopped moving in the water. Slowly, she turned her head, and her eyes met his across the 20 yards of moonlit water. He expected her to cover herself, to recoil in shame or fear. He had seen that look in women's eyes before, the terror of being seen, of being vulnerable. But Clara did not. She did not hide. She simply stood there in the cold water, the ruined dress in her hands, and met his stare with an unflinching gaze of her own. It was a look of defiance, of challenge. It said, "This is what was done to me. This is who I am now." Look, Eli was the one who broke contact. He turned away sharply, his jaw clenched, and went back to his work, his movements jerky and abrupt. The image of her was burned into his mind. The pale skin, the dark hair, the silent testament of her scars. Later that night, as they sat on opposite sides of the fire, the silence between them was different. It was heavier, charged with the things they had not said. She had put on one of his spare shirts. It was far too big for her, swallowing her small frame, but it was clean and warm. "Why are you alone out here?" she asked, her voice soft. The question caught him off guard. He looked into the flames, his face a mask of stone. He did not answer. He could not. The words were lodged in his throat, buried under 2 years of guilt and self-imposed exile. He had not always been alone. There had been a time when he had believed in things, in community, in doing the right thing. He had been riding into Granite Gulch 2 years ago when he saw the smoke. It was the Miller place, a small homestead on the edge of town. He knew them, a good family, John and Mary, with their 2 small children. He'd spurred his horse, his heart pounding, and had arrived to find hell on earth. 3 bandits were there, looting the place. They had John on his knees, a gun to his head. Mary was screaming, trying to shield her children. Eli had his rifle. He had a clear shot at one of the men. He was a good shot. He could have taken him down, created a diversion, changed the odds, but he had hesitated. For a split second, a single, damning heartbeat. He had weighed the risks. The other 2 might kill the family before he could get them. They might kill him. It was a fool's errand. In that moment of hesitation, the bandit had pulled the trigger. The world had exploded in gunfire and screams. By the time it was over, the bandits were gone, and the entire Miller family was dead. He had killed one of the bandits as they fled. But it was too late. It was meaningless. He had stumbled into town, covered in their blood, and told his story. They had listened, the faces of the townsfolk hard and unforgiving. They had not seen a man who had tried to help. They had seen a man who had arrived too late, who had let a family be slaughtered. They had called him a coward. The word had followed him. A whispered accusation in the general store, a shouted taunt in the saloon. He had not defended himself. He couldn't, because in the deepest, darkest part of his soul, he believed they were right. He had hesitated, and people had died. So he had left. He had ridden out into the wilderness, seeking a solitude so profound it might scour the memory from his mind. But it never did. He looked across the fire at Clara. How could he explain that to her? How could he tell her that the man who had saved her was a man who had failed to save anyone when it truly mattered? So he said nothing. He remained silent, a prisoner of his own past. Miles away, in a room that smelled of leather and expensive cigars, Royce Langley listened to the report from his foreman. His wife was gone, vanished. The scandal was already beginning to fester. A runaway bride was a humiliation he could not afford. His reputation, his authority, was built on a foundation of absolute control. He could not allow this one insignificant girl to tarnish it. He summoned 2 men to his study. They were not local boys. They were professionals, hard men who worked for bounty and had no qualms about the nature of their work. One was a wiry man with a weasel's face named Silas. The other was a broad, silent man named Jebediah. "She's out there somewhere," Royce said, his voice cold and even. He pushed a stack of gold coins across the polished surface of his desk. "I want her back, or I want her silenced. It makes no difference to me which. Just handle it. No witnesses, no trail back to me." Silas scooped up the coins with a greedy smile. "Dead or alive, Mr. Langley?" Royce looked at him, his eyes like chips of ice. "Just make sure the story ends." Clara dreamed of her mother's funeral. It had been a gray, drizzly day, much like the day before. She remembered the sound of the wet earth being shoveled onto the plain pine coffin. She remembered her father's hollow-eyed grief, a sorrow so deep it had seemed to swallow him whole. It was that sorrow that had driven him to the bottle, and the bottle that had driven him to ruin. In her dream, she reached out for her mother's hand, but it dissolved into mist. She was alone in a field of tombstones, and they all had her name on them. She woke with a gasp, her body drenched in a cold sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The darkness was absolute. She was alone. Panic, cold and suffocating, closed in around her. Then, a shape moved in the darkness beside her. Eli. He had been sleeping a few feet away, a silent form in a bedroll. He sat up, alerted by her sudden movement. He did not speak, did not light a lamp. He simply sat there, a quiet, steady presence in the overwhelming dark. His stillness was an anchor. She focused on the faint outline of his shoulders against the slightly less black opening of the tent. Slowly, her breathing evened out. The frantic pounding of her heart subsided. A strange impulse moved her. She reached out a tentative hand and touched his side. Her fingers brushed against a patch of raised, puckered skin beneath his shirt. An old wound. He went rigid at her touch, but he did not pull away. He let her hand rest there, her small, cool fingers exploring the terrain of an old pain. It was a silent conversation. She had shown him her scars. Now, she was acknowledging his in that small, quiet gesture. A fragile bridge was built between their 2 solitudes. It was a fleeting moment of warmth, of human connection in the vast, cold wilderness. The moment was shattered by a sound, faint, distant, but unmistakable. The sound of shod horses moving at a steady pace through the hills. It was not the sound of a lone rider. It was 2, maybe 3. Eli was on his feet in an instant, all traces of stillness gone. He was a predator, alert and dangerous. He moved to the edge of the camp, listening intently. His head cocked. The sound grew slightly louder, then faded as the riders passed by in a neighboring valley. They were not on their trail. Not yet. But they were out there. The world had found them. Eli turned back to her, his face grim in the faint starlight. "We have to go," he said. "Now." Their brief sanctuary was gone. They were no longer just 2 lost souls in the wilderness. They were being hunted. And they had to run. The sound of the horses had been a ghost in the night, a warning that had driven them from the relative safety of the low hills into the jagged teeth of the mountains. They traveled north, into the Wind River foothills, a landscape that was both majestic and cruel. Towering granite peaks clawed at the sky, their upper reaches permanently clad in armor of ice and snow. Below, in the deep, shadowed valleys, The air was sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. Here, winter still held its ground, with stubborn patches of snow lingering beneath the dense canopy of the lodgepole pines, melting into a slow, constant drip that kept the ground perpetually cold and wet. The journey was harder now. The terrain was unforgiving, a treacherous maze of steep, rocky trails and sudden drop-offs. Eli led the horse, Dust, with a quiet, focused intensity, his eyes constantly scanning the path ahead. Clara walked beside him, her initial weakness replaced by a grim endurance. The cuts on her feet had begun to heal, toughening into calloused skin. The ache in her ribs was a dull, constant companion, but it no longer stole her breath with every step. The wilderness was stripping her down, burning away the soft, useless parts of her, and leaving behind something harder, more resilient. Their world shrank to the fundamentals of survival: food, warmth, shelter. These were the only things that mattered. Eli became her teacher, his lessons delivered not in lectures, but in quiet, patient demonstrations. He showed her how to find the driest wood, the dead, standing pines that had been cured by the wind and sun. He taught her how to build a fire in the damp air, starting with a small, protected nest of tinder and coaxing it to life with a steady, gentle breath. She learned to read the subtle signs of the land, to see the tracks of deer in the soft mud, to recognize the edible roots that grew along the creek beds. One afternoon, they stopped by a stream that ran deep and clear over a bed of polished stones. Their supplies were running low, and the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs had become a constant ache. "We need to eat," Eli stated, his voice flat. He waded into the icy water, his jeans instantly soaked to the mid-thigh. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his eyes fixed on the dark, darting shapes of the trout that held steady in the current. "What are you doing?" Clara asked, watching from the bank. "Fishing," he replied, without looking at her. He showed her how to move, how to let her hands drift with the current, how to wait for the precise moment to strike, pinning the slippery fish to the gravelly bottom. Her first few attempts were clumsy failures, her movements too quick, too eager. The trout darted away, vanishing into the shadows. She shivered in the frigid water, her teeth chattering, a frustrated sigh escaping her lips. "You're thinking too much," Eli said, his voice a low murmur from a few feet away. "You have to feel it, be a part of the water, be the rock the fish hides behind." She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to his words, to the rush of the water over the stones. She tried again, letting her hands become heavy, patient. A dark shape drifted near. She waited, her breath held tight in her chest. Then, in a single, fluid motion, she struck. Her fingers closed around a firm, wriggling body. A jolt of triumph, fierce and primal, shot through her. She lifted the fish from the water, a beautiful rainbow trout, its sides shimmering with pink and silver. She held it up, a wide, incredulous grin spreading across her face. And then she laughed. It was not a soft, polite chuckle. It was a full, unrestrained peal of laughter, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. The sound seemed alien in the vast, silent wilderness. It startled the birds in the nearby pines. It startled Eli, who stopped what he was doing and stared at her, his eyes wide with surprise. It startled Clara herself. She clamped a hand over her mouth, her eyes going wide, as if she had just released something wild and dangerous into the world. The grin faded, replaced by a look of confusion, and then a shadow of guilt. They cooked the fish over a small, smoky fire, the smell of the sizzling flesh making their mouths water. They ate in their usual silence, but the silence was different now. The sound of her laughter lingered in the air between them, an echo of a life she thought she had lost forever. That night, as they sat by the fire, the shadows of the tall pines dancing around them, she looked at her hands. They were chapped and scratched, the nails broken and rimmed with dirt. They were not the hands of a gentleman's daughter. They were the hands of a survivor. A wave of profound sadness washed over her. She thought of her father, of the fine house she had grown up in, of the life of comfort and propriety that had been laid out for her. She had thrown it all away. She had run, and in doing so, had brought shame and ruin upon her family name. "I shouldn't have done it," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackle of the flames. "I shouldn't have run. I abandoned my father, my family." Eli looked at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He was quiet for so long she thought he had not heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but it held an edge she had never heard before. It was the sound of cold, controlled anger. "You didn't leave them," he said, his eyes boring into hers. "They sold you." The words were brutal, but they were true. They struck her with the force of a physical blow, shattering the fragile construct of her guilt. She had been carrying the blame as if it were her own, another burden to add to her load. But he was right. She had not been a participant in the transaction. She had been the currency. For the first time, she saw her father's actions not as a desperate measure born of grief, but as a betrayal of the most fundamental kind. He had not lost her. He had given her away. Eli's anger was a gift. It was a mirror, reflecting a truth she had been unwilling to see. It was the first time anyone had been angry on her behalf. The next day, they climbed higher, the air growing thin and cold. They paused to rest in a small grove of ancient, twisted pines that clung to the side of the mountain. The view was breathtaking, a panorama of snow-capped peaks and deep, green valleys that stretched to the horizon. Clara felt a sense of awe, a feeling so large it seemed to push the fear and sorrow from her heart. If only for a moment. She turned to Eli, who was standing beside her, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. A sudden, overwhelming urge to connect with him, to thank him for the unspoken things he had given her, rose up within her. She took a hesitant step closer, reached out, and pressed her lips to the rough wool of his shirt, just over his shoulder. He went completely still, his body rigid as stone. She felt the muscle in his shoulder clench beneath her lips. She pulled back, her heart pounding, afraid she had crossed a line, but he did not move away. Slowly, he turned his head and looked down at her. His eyes were dark, turbulent pools of emotion she could not name. He lifted a hand, his calloused fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before they gently cupped her jaw. He leaned down, and his lips brushed against her temple. His touch was feather-light, a fleeting moment of warmth against her cold skin. It was a kiss of infinite tenderness, and it undid her completely. Then, just as quickly, he pulled away. He dropped his hand and turned back to the view, his jaw set, his shoulders squared as if bracing against an unseen force. The moment was over. The space between them, once empty, was now filled with a crackling, unspoken tension. That night, the exhaustion hit her not as a physical weariness, but as a collapse of the soul. They had made camp in a sheltered alcove of rock, the fire a small beacon of warmth against the encroaching cold. She ate without tasting, moved without thinking. The brief moment of connection with Eli had awakened something in her, a dormant yearning for touch, for comfort, for a human warmth that went beyond the heat of a fire, and it terrified her. To want again was to be vulnerable again. To open herself to another was to risk being broken again. She stood up, intending to fetch more water from the nearby spring, but her legs felt like lead. She took one step, then another, and then the strength simply left her. She swayed, a wave of blackness washing over her. "I can't walk any further," she moaned, the words a near-perfect echo of her first night. But this time, the exhaustion was not in her limbs, but in her heart. She sank to the ground, her body trembling with a fatigue that was bone-deep and absolute. Eli was beside her in an instant. He knelt, his face etched with concern. Without a word, He lifted her into his arms and carried her to her bedroll inside the small tent. He laid her down gently, pulling the blankets up to her chin. He started to move away, to give her the space he always gave her, but she reached out, her fingers closing around his wrist. "Don't go," she whispered. He hesitated, his body torn between the instinct to flee and the pull of her plea. He looked down at her, at the fear and the longing warring in her eyes. He gave a slow nod and then lay down on his own bedroll beside her. He did not touch her. He simply lay there, a few inches of space separating their bodies, a silent, solid presence in the darkness. He was giving her what she needed most: closeness without demand, comfort without threat. She lay on her back, staring up at the dark canvas ceiling, acutely aware of his breathing, of the warmth radiating from his body. She was trembling, not from cold, but from a fear so profound it felt like a sickness. But beneath the fear, something else was stirring. Trust. After what felt like an eternity, she made a choice. Slowly, she turned onto her side, facing him, bridging the small gap that separated them. Far below them, on the other side of the ridge, two men reined in their horses. Silas, the weaselly one, pointed a long, dirty finger toward the sky. "Smoke," he rasped, a greedy light in his eyes. "Up there, in the rocks." Jebediah, his silent, hulking partner, nodded, his gaze fixed on the faint, gray wisp that curled into the evening air. They urged their horses forward, their progress slow and difficult in the fading light. For an hour, they climbed, the trail growing steeper, more treacherous. But when they finally reached the ridge where they had seen the smoke, they found nothing. Just a small, hastily abandoned campsite. The fire was almost out, a few embers glowing faintly in a circle of stones. There were tracks, one horse and two sets of footprints, leading deeper into the impassable maze of rocks and canyons. "Lost them," Silas spat, kicking at the dirt in frustration. "He's clever. This one?" Jebediah grunted. "We'll find them. This is his country, but it will be our trap." They made their own camp for the night, the promise of Royce Langley's gold keeping them warm against the mountain chill. Inside the tent, the world had shrunk to the small, dark space occupied by two people. The distant threat was forgotten. The vast wilderness outside might as well not have existed. Clara lay facing Eli, her trembling slowly subsiding in the quiet warmth of his presence. He had not moved, had not reached for her. He was waiting, letting her set the terms. She lifted a hand, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the rough stubble scratching lightly against her skin. He closed his eyes at her touch, a muscle feathering in his cheek. Emboldened, she leaned in, and her lips found his. The kiss was not gentle. It was intense, hesitant, a collision of desperation and long-suppressed need. It was the kiss of two lonely, wounded people, finding a momentary solace in the dark. It was raw and searching, a question asked without words. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, the air in the small tent thick with unspoken emotions. Clara looked at him, her eyes shining in the faint light filtering through the canvas. She had been a victim, a piece of property, a survivor. But in that moment, she knew she had to be something more. She had to claim her own life, her own desires. "I don't want to be saved," she whispered, her voice clear and steady in the profound silence. "I want to be chosen." She had laid her heart bare, offering him the most vulnerable, honest part of herself. She was not a damsel in distress waiting for a rescuer. She was a woman, asking to be seen, to be wanted, for who she was, not for what had been done to her. Eli stared at her, his expression a storm of conflict. He heard her words, understood the weight of them. He saw the strength and the courage it had taken for her to say them, and he wanted to answer her. He wanted to tell her that he saw her, that he chose her, but the ghosts of his past were there in the tent with them, the faces of the Miller family, the word coward branded on his soul. He was a broken man, a man who had fled from the world. What right did he have to choose anyone? What could he possibly offer her but more danger, more hardship, more of his own brokenness? He opened his mouth to speak, but the words would not come. He remained silent, his inability to answer a chasm that opened between them in the dark. Eli's silence in the tent that night was an answer in itself. It was not a rejection, but an admission of his own brokenness, a truth he could not yet put into words. The space between them hummed with unspoken things, with the raw, fragile hope Clara had offered and the heavy weight of the past he could not set down. They slept inches apart, two solitary islands separated by a turbulent sea of memory. In the morning, they moved on, the question hanging unanswered in the cold mountain air. For 2 more days, they pushed deeper into the mountains, the world a vertical landscape of rock and pine. The pursuit seemed to have faded. The silence of the high country was absolute, broken only by the cry of a hawk circling in the vast, empty sky. They were gaunt, bone-weary, living on the edge of their endurance. It was on the 3rd day, as they followed a narrow game trail around the shoulder of a ridge, that Eli suddenly stopped. He held up a hand, his body going still. Clara froze beside him, her eyes scanning the dense woods. "What is it?" she whispered. "Smoke," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But not a campfire, a chimney." He dismounted, leaving dust reins to trail on the ground. He moved forward with a hunter's stealth, Clara following in his footsteps. They crested a small rise, and there, nestled in a small, sheltered meadow, was a cabin. It was a small, solid-looking structure of notched logs, chinked with mud and moss, with a sagging roof and a stone chimney from which a thin, lazy wisp of smoke curled. But something was wrong. The smoke was old, the smell faint, more memory than fire. There was a stillness about the place, a deep, settled silence that spoke of abandonment. "I know this place," Eli said quietly. "Belonged to an old trapper, Jedediah Kane. He hasn't been down to Granite Gulch in over a year. I reckon he's dead." The thought should have been grim, but to Clara, the cabin was a miracle. It was shelter. It was 4 solid walls and a roof that did not leak. They approached with caution, but the place was empty, save for the ghost of old Jedediah. The door creaked open on leather hinges, revealing a single, dusty room. A rough-hewn table and a single chair stood in the center, a stone hearth, filled with the cold ashes of a long, dead fire, dominated one wall. A narrow cot with a lumpy mattress was pushed against the other. It was not much, but it was a palace. They scavenged the cabin like castaways on a deserted island. They found a small store of dried beans and salted meat, a canister of coffee, and half a bag of flour. In a wooden chest at the foot of the cot, they discovered a treasure: 2 thick wool blankets, several flannel shirts, and a pair of sturdy denim trousers that were far too large for Clara, but infinitely more practical than Eli's oversized shirt. Tucked into a corner was a stack of yellowed newspapers and a tattered map of the territory, its creases worn soft with use. While Eli set about clearing the ashes from the hearth, Clara explored the small space. On a shelf above the cot, she found a small, hand-held mirror, its silvering tarnished and spotted with age. She picked it up, her fingers hesitating before she turned it over. She had not seen her own reflection since the day of the wedding. She hardly recognized the woman who stared back at her. Her face was thin, gaunt, her cheekbones sharp angles beneath tanned skin. A faint, yellowing bruise still lingered along her jaw, a ghost of Royce's touch. But it was her eyes that held her. They were not the eyes of the frightened, uncertain girl who had been traded for a clean ledger. They were clear, direct, and unnervingly steady. They were the eyes of a woman who had stared into the abyss and had not blinked. They were the eyes of a wolf. A stranger was living in her skin. a harder, wilder creature than the one she had been. She did not know if she liked this new woman, but she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this woman would survive. That night, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they were warm. A fire blazed in the hearth, chasing the damp chill from the room and painting the log walls in a flickering, golden light. The smell of coffee and frying salt pork filled the small space, a scent so wonderfully domestic it made Clara's throat ache. They ate sitting on the floor before the fire, the tin plates warm in their laps. They did not speak, but the silence was no longer heavy with tension. It was a comfortable, shared quiet. The silence of two people who have found a momentary port in a storm. After they had eaten, Eli took out his knife and began to methodically sharpen it on a whetstone he produced from his saddlebag. Clara watched him, the firelight catching the planes of his face, the intense concentration in his dark eyes. He was a man of profound silences, his past a locked room to which he held the only key, but here, in the warmth of the cabin, he seemed different. The hard lines around his eyes had softened. The ever-present tension in his shoulders had eased. She rose and went to the cot, pulling one of the thick wool blankets from it. She returned to the hearth and draped it over his shoulders. He stopped his work, his hands going still, but he did not look up. She knelt in front of him and, with a tentative hand, took the knife and whetstone from his grasp, setting them aside. Then she took his hands in hers. They were rough, calloused, scarred, the hands of a man who had lived a hard life. She brought them to her lips and pressed a soft kiss into each palm. It was an act of profound surrender and of profound claiming. A current seemed to pass between them, a spark in the warm, firelit air. He finally lifted his head, and his eyes met hers. In their dark depths, she saw the walls he had built around himself begin to crumble. He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw, his touch a question. She leaned into his hand, her answer a silent yes. They came together on the furs and blankets before the hearth, a slow, emotional collision. For Clara, it was a journey into uncharted territory, a reclaiming of something that had been stolen from her. His touch was not like Royce's, which had been brutal and selfish. Eli's touch was hesitant, reverent, as if he were holding something precious and fragile. He moved with a slowness that was a balm to her wounded spirit, his gentleness a silent promise to undo the damage that had been done. It was not a gentle exploration. It was a desperate claiming, a raw and honest expression of a need that had gone unanswered for too long. It was the fierce, tender coming together of two broken people, finding in each other a momentary wholeness. As the fire burned down to glowing embers, he held her, his body a warm, solid weight against hers. He smoothed the hair back from her face, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. And then he whispered her name. Clara. He spoke it as if it were a prayer, a word he had been forbidden to say, and was only now allowing himself to speak. It was the first time he had said her name, and in that single word, she heard the answer to the question she had asked in the darkness of the tent. He had chosen her. The next morning, she woke in his arms, the early morning light filtering through the cabin's single, grimy window. A sense of peace, fragile and unfamiliar, settled over her. She felt like a new person, reborn in the fire of the previous night, and she knew, with an unshakable certainty, that she could never go back to being the woman she was. She sat up and looked at her hair, which fell in a tangled chestnut mass over her shoulders. Royce had liked her hair long. He had told her so on their wedding day, his fingers twisting it, pulling it, a gesture of ownership. She looked around the cabin, her eyes landing on the hunting knife Eli had been sharpening. She picked it up. Its weight was solid, purposeful in her hand. "I want you to cut my hair," she said. Eli, who was rekindling the fire, turned to look at her. He saw the knife in her hand, the resolute set of her jaw. "Why?" he asked. "Because it's not mine," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's his. He liked it long." He understood immediately. It was not just hair, it was a chain, a link to a past she needed to sever. He hesitated, a flicker of reluctance in his eyes. He reached out and touched a long strand of her hair, the silk of it soft against his rough fingers. Then he nodded. He took the knife from her and tested its edge. He stood behind her, and she felt the cold steel of the blade against her neck. She did not flinch. She closed her eyes and held her breath. He worked slowly, carefully, his hands surprisingly steady. The long strands of hair fell to the floor, pooling around her feet like shed memories. When he was finished, he laid the knife aside. Her hair was short, cropped to the nape of her neck, the ends uneven and boyish. She ran her hands through it. It felt light, free. She went to the small, tarnished mirror and looked at herself. The woman who stared back was a stranger still, but a stranger she was beginning to understand. The short hair framed her face, emphasizing the strength in her jaw, the clarity of her eyes. The last vestige of the old Clara was gone. She turned to Eli, a small, fierce smile on her lips. She went to the wall beside the hearth, where years of smoke had stained the logs a deep, dark brown. She picked up the tip of a charred stick from the fireplace. "Proof we were here," she said. She carefully drew the letters C.M.T. into the wood. Clara May Thompson. It was a reclamation of her own name. Eli watched her, his expression softening. He took the knife, the same one that had cut her hair, and next to her initials, he carved his own E.M. The two sets of letters stood side by side, a quiet declaration in the dusty silence of the cabin. They had found a sanctuary, a place to heal, a place to begin again. The moment of peace was shattered by a deafening crack. The world exploded in a shower of splintering wood and flying debris. A hole, the size of a fist, appeared in the log wall just inches from Eli's head. A rifle shot. Time seemed to slow down. Eli shoved Clara to the floor, his body covering hers as a second shot ripped through the cabin, shattering the single window pane. He grunted, a sharp intake of breath, and she felt a sudden, wet warmth spreading across her back. "Eli!" she screamed, scrambling out from under him. There was a dark, blossoming stain on his left shoulder, blood soaking through the fabric of his shirt. He pushed himself up, his face pale, his teeth gritted in pain. "Get the rifle," he snarled, his eyes fixed on the door. The bounty hunters, they had found them. Clara moved without thinking, her body propelled by pure, cold adrenaline. She grabbed Eli's rifle from where it leaned against the wall. Through the shattered window, she saw a flash of movement. A man, the wiry, weasel-faced one, was reloading, taking cover behind a large pine tree. Eli was on his feet, his own pistol in his hand, his wounded arm hanging uselessly at his side. Another shot came, this one thudding into the heavy wooden door. "They're trying to pin us in," Eli said, his voice strained. "They'll try to burn us out." As if his words were a command, a flaming torch arced through the air and landed on the cabin's dry, sagging roof. A wisp of smoke, then a lick of flame, began to eat at the old wood. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm Clara. But then she looked at Eli, his face a mask of pain and grim determination, and a different emotion took hold, a white-hot rage. They had found her sanctuary, and they were burning it to the ground. They had hurt him. She rested the barrel of the rifle on the edge of the shattered window, just as her father had taught her to do years ago when they would hunt for deer. She took a breath, held it, and lined up the sights on the weasel-faced man. He poked his head out from behind the tree, his own rifle raised. She squeezed the trigger. The kick of the rifle slammed against her shoulder. The roar of the gun was deafening in the small space. The man behind the tree jerked backward, a look of profound surprise on his face. He dropped his rifle and collapsed to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut. He did not move again. Clara stared, her mind a blank slate. She had just killed a man. The thought was distant, unreal. There was no time for shock, no time for horror. The roof was burning now, smoke filling the cabin, thick and acrid. The second bounty hunter, the big, silent one, fired one last, desperate shot into the cabin, then turned and ran, disappearing into the dense woods. He was not running in fear. He was retreating, heading back to his employer, heading back to Royce. "We have to go," Eli choked out, stumbling toward the back wall. "There's a loose log, Jedediah's bolt hole." He kicked at a log near the floor, and it swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow opening. The fire was roaring now, the heat intense. They crawled through the opening, emerging into the cool, clean air behind the cabin, just as a section of the roof collapsed with a great shower of sparks and flame. They did not look back. They fled into the woods, Eli leaning heavily on Clara, a trail of blood marking their path. The sanctuary was gone, reduced to a pillar of black smoke against the clear blue sky. Their proof, carved into the wall, was turning to ash. As they stumbled through the forest, a terrible, clear understanding dawned on Clara. There was no hiding. There was no running away. The wilderness was not big enough to conceal them. Royce's reach was long, his malice relentless. They had tried to escape the world, but the world had followed them, and it had tried to kill them. The second man had gotten away. He would go back and tell Royce where they were, what had happened. He would bring more men. There was only one path left to them. They had to stop running. They had to turn and face what was hunting them. They had to go back to the town, back to civilization, and confront the man who had tried to destroy her. They had to face justice, shame, and everything that was waiting for them. The flight was over. The fight was about to begin. The journey back to civilization was a slow, painful descent from the harsh purity of the mountains into the messy, complicated world of men. Eli's shoulder was a constant, throbbing agony. Clara had packed the wound with moss and bound it tightly with strips of cloth torn from her borrowed trousers, but it was a crude field dressing at best. He rode slumped in the saddle, his face pale and slick with a feverish sweat, while she walked beside him, leading dust down the winding trails. The roles had reversed. She was the strong one now, her small frame a pillar of unwavering resolve. They saw Granite Gulch before they reached it, a haphazard collection of wooden buildings squatting in a wide, dusty valley. A plume of smoke from the blacksmith's forge rising into the clear air. For Eli, it was the site of his greatest shame, a place he had sworn never to see again. For Clara, it was the battlefield she had chosen. As they came down the final slope and onto the main street, a hush fell over the town. It began with a single merchant, sweeping the boardwalk in front of his store, who stopped and stared. Then a woman, shaking a rug from a second-story window, froze, her hands still. Soon, heads were turning in the street, doors were creaking open, and faces were appearing in windows. Whispers followed them like a swarm of unseen insects. "Is that him? That's Monroe, the coward." And the woman, "Good Lord, is that Langley's runaway bride? Look at him, he's wounded, and she's dressed like a man." The words were stones, thrown from the shadows of doorways and the safety of the crowd. Clara felt the color rise in her cheeks, but she kept her chin high, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She would not let them break her. She felt Eli tense in the saddle behind her, the weight of the town's judgment settling on his wounded shoulders. She reached back and squeezed his hand, a small, fierce gesture of solidarity. He squeezed back, his grip surprisingly strong. They stopped in front of the largest building on the street, which served as both the town hall and the sheriff's office. Before they could even dismount, a figure emerged from the saloon across the street, and the crowd parted before him as if he were a king. It was Royce Langley. He was impeccably dressed in a fine black suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, his face a mask of righteous indignation. He looked every inch the powerful, respectable man of property. He was not alone. The second bounty hunter, the big silent one named Jebediah, stood a few paces behind him, a living, breathing testament to the truth of his story. Royce's eyes, cold and hard as river stones, fixed on Clara. "There she is," he boomed, his voice carrying across the silent street. "The thief and adulteress. She ran from my house, from her sacred vows, stealing my horse and a great deal of my money." He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at her. "And that is not the worst of her sins. She consorted with this coward." He spat the word, gesturing to Eli. "And together, they murdered a man I sent to bring her home peacefully. A good man, with a family." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Theft was one thing, murder was another. "Sheriff," Royce commanded, his gaze shifting to the door of the town hall, from which a portly man with a tin star pinned to his vest had emerged. "I demand you arrest this woman. She is a murderess. She must be held accountable for her crimes. She must hang." The sheriff, a man named Bartholomew, looked from Royce's imperious face to Clara's defiant one, then to Eli, who was slowly, painfully dismounting from his horse. The sheriff was a man who understood power, and Royce Langley held all of it. "Well now, Mr. Langley," he began, his voice placating, "we'll certainly look into—" "There is nothing to look into," Royce cut him off. "My man, Jebediah, was a witness. He saw her shoot Silas down in cold blood." Eli stepped forward, placing himself between Royce and Clara. He was unsteady on his feet, his face ashen with pain, but his eyes burned with a cold fire. "That's a lie," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "They ambushed us. They tried to burn us alive." A murmur went through the crowd. Royce let out a short, derisive laugh. "And who are they to believe? You, Monroe, the man who ran and hid while the Miller family was slaughtered? A known coward, telling tales to protect his whore?" The words struck Clara harder than a physical blow. She saw Eli's good hand clench into a fist, his whole body trembling with a rage he could barely contain. Before he could lunge, she put a hand on his arm. "Not now, not like this." "I am not a whore," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "And I am not a murderer." She turned her gaze from Royce to the faces in the crowd, searching for a single flicker of understanding, of compassion. She found only suspicion and morbid curiosity. Her eyes landed on a man in a black coat, standing on the steps of the small church at the end of the street. The preacher. With a desperation that overrode her fear, she pushed through the crowd, ignoring their shocked whispers, and ran to him. "Please, Reverend," she begged, her voice cracking. "You are a man of God. You must hear my side. You must believe me." The preacher, a stern-faced man named Allen, looked down at her, his expression clouded with doubt. He saw a disheveled woman in men's clothing, her hair hacked short, her face bruised. She looked like a wild thing, not the respectable wife of a cattle baron. "My child," he began, his voice full of pious uncertainty. "The law must take its course." "Please," she whispered, tears finally welling in her eyes. "He's lying." It was then that a small movement caught her eye. An older woman, the blacksmith's wife, a woman with kind, weary eyes, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Another woman, standing beside her, looked at Royce, then back at Clara, and a flicker of doubt crossed her face. A few of the town's women began to draw closer, their expressions shifting from condemnation to a guarded curiosity. They had seen men like Royce Langley before. They had seen the kind of bruises that did not come from a fall from a horse. "There will be a hearing," a new voice announced. Cutting through the tension, an older man, tall and lean, with a neat gray beard and intelligent eyes, stepped out of the town hall. He was Judge Abram Pettigrew, a circuit judge who, by a stroke of fate, was in Granite Gulch for the week. This is a serious accusation. It will be heard properly. In 1 hour. Inside. The crowd began to disperse, buzzing with anticipation. The sheriff, looking relieved to have the decision taken from his hands, led Clara and Eli into the town hall. Royce watched them go, a thin, triumphant smile on his lips. He had the law, the witnesses, and public opinion on his side. The girl was already as good as hanged. The hearing was a tense, claustrophobic affair. The main room of the town hall had been hastily converted into a courtroom, with the judge seated behind a large wooden desk and the townsfolk crammed onto benches and standing along the walls. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and cheap perfume. Clara and Eli stood before the judge, with Royce and Jebediah on the opposite side. The proceedings began, and Royce's version of events, delivered with a smooth, practiced sincerity, painted a damning picture. He spoke of his runaway bride, his concern for her safety, his hiring of 2 good men to bring her home. Jebediah, in a low, monosyllabic testimony, confirmed it all. He told the court he saw Clara fire the rifle, saw Silas fall. The law was clear. A man was dead, and she had pulled the trigger. Judge Pettigrew listened patiently, his face impassive. He then turned to Clara. "Mrs. Langley," he said, his voice not unkind, "you have heard the testimony against you. What do you have to say in your defense?" All eyes were on her. She could feel their weight, their judgment. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and fury. How could she make them believe her? Before she could find her voice, Eli stepped forward. "I did it," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that startled the entire room. "I killed him." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "No," she whispered. The woman was terrified. Eli continued, his gaze locked on the judge, ignoring Clara's protest. "Those men came at us with guns blazing. I fired back to protect her. She never touched the rifle." He was trying to save her, to take the noose from her neck and place it around his own. He was offering to sacrifice himself, to die a coward in the eyes of the world, to give her a chance to live. "No," Clara said, her voice suddenly strong, clear, and full of a fire that silenced the room. "He's lying. He is lying to protect me." She turned to the judge, her eyes blazing. "I will not let him do this. I killed the man. I shot him because he was trying to kill us." She took a deep breath, and the story came pouring out of her, not in a torrent of hysterics, but in a steady, powerful stream of truth. She spoke of her father's debts, of being sold like livestock to a man she had never met. She described the wedding, the cold, loveless vows, the way Royce had looked at her, not with affection, but with the cold appraisal of a man examining a new possession. And then, her voice dropping to a low, trembling whisper, she told them what happened next. She spoke of the locked bedroom door, of Royce's drunken rage, of the blows that had rained down on her. She described the pain, the humiliation, the terror of a man who was her husband, who held absolute power over her, and who took pleasure in her suffering. She spoke of the bruises on her ribs, the whip scars on her back, the flight in the night with no shoes on her feet. "I ran because if I had stayed, I would not have survived," she said, her voice raw with emotion. "I ran for my life, and he sent those men not to bring me home, but to silence me, to hide his shame. We did not ambush them. They ambushed us. They set our shelter on fire. They shot Mr. Monroe. I fired that rifle because it was him or us. It was a choice between my life and his. I chose to live." When she finished, a profound, absolute silence had fallen over the courtroom. Not a single person moved or spoke. They stared at her, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and a dawning, horrified understanding. She had not just defended her actions, She had put Royce Langley on trial. Royce stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. His carefully constructed facade of the wronged husband had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. He looked at the faces of the townsfolk, and for the first time, he saw not respect, but revulsion. The silence stretched on. Each second a new accusation. He could feel his power, his reputation, his entire world dissolving around him. And then, something inside him snapped. His carefully controlled composure vanished, replaced by a volcanic, irrational rage. All his life, he had taken what he wanted. He had never been defied, never been questioned. The sight of Clara, standing there, not broken and defeated, but strong and defiant, was more than he could bear. With a guttural roar, he lunged across the space that separated them. "You lying witch!" he screamed, his face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. His hand flew up and he struck her, a vicious, open-handed blow across the face that sent her staggering backward. The crack of the impact echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. He had just confirmed every word she had said. Before Royce could strike her again, a blur of motion exploded from beside her. Eli, with a roar that was more animal than human, launched himself at Royce. The two men crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. The courtroom erupted into chaos, people screaming, scrambling back from the brawl. It was not a fight, it was a mauling. Eli, fueled by 2 years of suppressed guilt and a white-hot protective fury, was a force of nature. Despite his wounded shoulder, he rained blows down on Royce, his fists striking with a brutal, punishing force. Royce, a man accustomed to having others fight his battles, was no match for him. He tried to fight back, but Eli's rage was a tidal wave that overwhelmed him. Eli's hands closed around Royce's throat, his thumbs pressing into his windpipe. Royce's face turned a deep, mottled purple, his eyes bulging with terror. Eli was going to kill him, right there on the floor of the courtroom. The coward of Granite Gulch was about to commit murder in front of the entire town. "Eli, stop!" Clara's voice cut through the haze of his rage. "Stop! Don't become him! Please!" He looked up, his eyes wild, and saw her. Her face was red from Royce's blow, but her eyes were clear, pleading. She was not asking for vengeance. She was asking him to be the man she knew he was. Slowly, agonizingly, his fingers uncurled from Royce's throat. He slumped back, his breath coming in ragged, shuddering gasps. Judge Pettigrew slammed his gavel on the desk, his face a thunderous mask. "Sheriff Bartholomew," he bellowed, "arrest that man." The sheriff, who had been frozen in indecision, finally acted. He and 2 other men hauled the gasping, blubbering Royce Langley to his feet. "Royce Langley," the judge declared, his voice ringing with authority, "I find you guilty of assault, of conspiracy, and of bearing false witness. You will be held for the circuit court. As for you, Mrs. Langley," he said, his voice softening, "your actions were clearly in self-defense. You are free to go. This hearing is concluded." Justice had been served, but justice does not erase scars. As the crowd began to file out of the room, their whispers now a mixture of awe and pity, Clara felt the last of her strength drain away. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a hollow, trembling emptiness. She turned and fled, pushing her way through the throng of people, desperate for air, for solitude. She found herself in the dusty, refuse-strewn alley behind the town hall. She leaned against the rough wooden wall and slid to the ground, the world a dizzying, unfocused blur. The trial was over. She was free, but she was also utterly, completely alone. She had no home, no family, no name but the one she had tried to escape. She had won, but she had lost everything. A great, shuddering sob tore through her, and she buried her face in her hands, the tears coming in a hot, cleansing flood. A moment later, she felt a presence beside her. She looked up through her tears and saw Eli, kneeling in the dirt in front of her. His face was bruised from the fight, his shirt stained with his own blood, but his eyes were full of a deep, unwavering tenderness. He did not speak. He simply waited. "What do I do now?" she whispered, her voice broken. "Where do I go?" He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to simply hold the space around her. His gaze was steady, a lifeline in the swirling chaos of her emotions. "Wherever you can't walk," he said, his voice quiet but absolute, a vow spoken in the dust of an alleyway. "I'll carry you." Eli's promise, spoken in the filth of the alley, was not a grand declaration made under a starry sky. It was a foundation stone, laid in the dirt, upon which they could build a life. Royce Langley was jailed, awaiting the circuit judge's final sentence, his power in Granite Gulch broken. But Clara and Eli could not stay. The town was a landscape of ghosts for him and a stage for her humiliation. They needed a place of their own, a place where the whispers could not reach them. They found it 5 miles downriver, a forgotten piece of land claimed by thistle and time, an old homestead, marked on a county map as belonging to a family that had been wiped out by fever a decade prior. All that remained was the stone foundation of a cabin and a blackened skeleton of charred logs, a monument to some long-ago tragedy. The land was harsh, a tangle of overgrown brush and stubborn rocks, but it was bordered by the river on one side and a stand of tall pines on the other. It was a place a person could defend. It was a place a person could begin. With the last of Eli's money, they bought the deed, a few tools, and a wagon loaded with meager supplies. They also bought the canvas tent that had been their first shelter, a silent acknowledgement of where their journey had begun. They set it up near the riverbank, and it became their home as they set about the back-breaking work of carving a life from the unforgiving land. The first weeks were a blur of relentless labor. They worked from sunup to sundown, their bodies aching, their hands raw and blistered. Eli, his shoulders still healing but his strength returning, taught Clara how to use an axe, how to swing it with the rhythm of her own breath so that the blade bit deep into the wood. She was a surprisingly quick study, her small frame wiry and strong. Together, they cleared the brush, their sickles swinging in a steady, metronomic beat. They felled the pines, the sharp, clean scent of sawdust filling the air as the tall trees crashed to the forest floor. They hewed the logs with adzes, squaring them into timbers that would form the walls of their new home. They were building more than a cabin. With every stone they cleared from the land, they were clearing the rubble from their own souls. With every log they lifted into place, they were rebuilding the foundations of their own lives. They worked as a team, their movements falling into a natural, unspoken rhythm. He would lift, and she would guide. She would hold a timber steady, and he would drive the pegs home. They spoke little during the day, their energy consumed by the sheer physical effort of their task. But in their shared labor, they found a new language, a deep and abiding communication that needed no words. The townsfolk of Granite Gulch had not forgotten them. In the beginning, the whispers followed them even to their small patch of land. Riders would sometimes pause on the trail across the river, watching them, their curiosity a palpable thing. But Clara and Eli paid them no mind. They were too busy living to worry about being watched. Then, one afternoon, a wagon rattled up the rough track to their homestead. It was the blacksmith, a burly man named Thomas, with his wife, Martha, the woman who had given Clara the silent nod of support in the street. Martha climbed down from the wagon, a covered basket in her hands. "We heard you were making a go of it out here," she said, her voice gruff but not unkind. She held out the basket. "Brought you some fresh bread and a stew. A body can't live on hard work alone." Clara was so stunned she could not speak. She simply took the basket, the warmth of it seeping into her cold hands. Thomas, meanwhile, was already unloading tools from the back of his wagon. "Heard you were building," he said to Eli. "Figured you could use a proper froe for splitting shingles. And I brought some nails. A man can never have too many nails. They did not stay long. They shared a cup of coffee by the fire, spoke of the weather, and then left as quietly as they had come. It was a small gesture, but it was a profound one. It was a quiet sign that judgment could fade, that a community could, in its own slow, cautious way, choose to heal. They were not the only ones. A few days later, Judge Pettigrew rode out, not in his official capacity, but as a man. He brought them a small crate of chickens and a signed copy of the deed to their land, ensuring there would be no legal challenges down the road. He looked at the half-built cabin, at the sweat on their brows, and he nodded, a look of quiet approval in his eyes. He had seen the truth in the courtroom, and he was bearing witness to the new truth they were building with their own hands. As autumn painted the cottonwoods along the river in brilliant shades of yellow and gold, the cabin was finished. It was small and simple, with a single room, a stone hearth, and 2 windows that looked out over the river. It was the most beautiful place Clara had ever seen. On their first night inside, with a fire crackling in the hearth and the wind sighing in the pines outside, she felt a sense of peace so deep it was almost a physical ache. Their life settled into a new rhythm, dictated by the seasons and the needs of the land. In the evenings, after the work was done, they would sit by the fire. One of the few things Clara had salvaged from her old life was a small, worn book of poetry her mother had given her. The pages were soft as cloth, the corners rounded with use. By the flickering light of a tallow lamp, she would read aloud, her voice a soft murmur in the quiet room. She read of love and loss, of faraway seas and ancient kings. Eli would sit and listen, his head leaning back against the rough-hewn wall, his eyes closed. He was not a man of letters, but he loved to hear her read. Her voice was a balm to the raw, wounded parts of him. He would reach for her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers, and she would lean against him, the solid warmth of his body a comfort and a shield. In these quiet moments, they were not a runaway bride and a haunted cowboy. They were simply a man and a woman, building a fragile, precious thing called a home. One morning, late in the fall, Clara woke with a familiar sickness churning in her stomach. At first, she dismissed it as a passing ailment, a result of their meager diet. But the sickness returned the next morning, and the morning after that. A cold, terrifying thought began to take root in her mind. She counted the days, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. It had been 2 months since the night in the trapper's cabin. The realization settled over her not as a joyous revelation, but as a wave of pure, unadulterated panic. A child, here, in this wild, unforgiving place, with a man who was still a stranger in so many ways. A child conceived in the shadow of violence and fear. What if it was not Eli's? The thought was a vile, poisonous thing, but it slithered into her mind nonetheless. The timing was close, too close for comfort. The thought of carrying Royce Langley's child was a horror beyond imagining. And even if it was Eli's, what kind of a life could they offer a child? They had nothing but a one-room cabin and a stubborn refusal to be broken. She was terrified of the future, terrified of the past, terrified of the life growing inside her. She said nothing to Eli for a week. She carried her secret like a stone in her belly, her fear a constant, metallic taste in her mouth. But he knew something was wrong. He watched her, his dark eyes missing nothing. He saw the way she would stop in the middle of a task and stare off into the distance, her face pale and drawn. He saw the shadows under her eyes, the way she would flinch when he touched her unexpectedly. Finally, one evening, as they sat by the fire, he could bear the silence no longer. "Clara," he said, his voice quiet. "What is it? What's troubling you?" She looked at him, and the carefully constructed wall of her composure crumbled. The words came out in a choked, desperate rush. I think I might be pregnant." She watched his face, bracing for his reaction. She expected shock, anger, maybe even accusation. But his expression did not change. He simply looked at her, his gaze steady and unwavering. He was quiet for a long time, so long that she began to tremble. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and even, but it held a core of absolute certainty. "If it's true," he said, looking directly into her eyes, "we'll make it true." It was not a promise of an easy life. It was not a denial of the hardships they would face. It was a simple, profound declaration of partnership. It was an acceptance of whatever came, good or bad, as something they would face together. The word was an anchor in the storm of her fear. We will make it true. He was not just choosing her. He was choosing their future, no matter how uncertain it might be. The tears she had been holding back for a week finally came. She broke down, her body shaking with great, shuddering sobs. But this time, it was different. She was not crying from fear or despair. She was crying from a sense of overwhelming, terrifying hope. He came to her and knelt before her, and he did not try to stop her tears. He simply held her, his arms a strong, safe harbor, until the storm had passed. Winter came early that year, and it came with a vengeance. A heavy blanket of snow fell, burying the world in a sea of white, isolating them completely. The river froze over, and the wind howled down from the mountains, a lonely, mournful sound that rattled the wooden shutters of the cabin. They were prepared. They had a store of firewood stacked high against the cabin wall, and a larder stocked with salted meat, dried beans, and the last of the vegetables from their small garden. But the cold was a relentless, insidious enemy. One morning, Eli went out to check his trap lines and was caught in a sudden, brutal blizzard. He made it back to the cabin hours later, half frozen, his face and hands a dead, waxy white. He stumbled through the door and collapsed on the floor, his body shaking uncontrollably. Clara dragged him to the fire, her heart pounding with a fear she had not felt since her flight from Royce. She worked frantically, stripping off his frozen clothes, rubbing his numb limbs to restore circulation. His fingers were the worst. They were stiff and white, devoid of all feeling. Frostbite. She knew if she was not careful, he could lose them. For 3 days and nights, she nursed him. She steeped willow bark for the pain and fever. She wrapped his hands in warm, wet cloths, changing them every hour. She sat by his side, holding his hands in hers, willing the life and warmth from her own body into his. He was delirious with fever, muttering names she did not recognize, reliving battles from a past he had never shared with her. In his delirium, the walls he kept so carefully guarded came down. He spoke of the Millers, of the fire, of the weight of the town's scorn. She listened, her heart aching for the pain he had carried alone for so long. She held his hands and whispered to him, telling him he was not a coward, that he was the bravest man she had ever known. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. He woke, his mind clear, and found her asleep in a chair beside him, her head resting on the edge of his cot, her hands still clutching his. His fingers were swollen and painful, but the color had returned to them. He would not lose them. She had saved him. He looked at her, at the dark circles of exhaustion under her eyes, and a wave of emotion so powerful it almost unmanned him washed over him. A few days later, as the winter sun cast a pale, watery light through the window, she was sitting on the edge of his cot, changing the dressings on his hands. He was watching her, his expression soft. "You chose me," she whispered, her voice so quiet he could barely hear it. It was not a question. It was a statement, a truth she was finally, fully allowing herself to believe. He reached up with his good hand and cupped her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. He looked into her eyes, and in his gaze, she saw the end of a long and lonely road. "Every damn day," he replied, his voice a low, rough whisper. The winter slowly loosened its grip on the land. The snow began to melt, and the sound of the river, breaking free from its prison of ice, was a roar of promise. Their life was hard, and it would continue to be hard. But it was their life, built with their own hands, on their own terms. The story ends here, but their life does not. It ends on a cold spring night, with a capricious late-season snow beginning to fall. They are not in the cabin. They are lying in their rebuilt tent, the canvas flapping in the wind. A familiar sound that is no longer a reminder of a desperate flight, but a lullaby of resilience. They are warm beneath a pile of furs, her head resting on his chest, his arms wrapped around her, his hand resting protectively on the slight swell of her belly. The snow falls, blanketing the world in a fresh, clean layer of white. It is a new beginning, and Clara lies there, listening to the wind and the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. And she doesn't say she's scared anymore. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can connect. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.